All right, guys, we're here with the last chapter that we're going to cover in this particular unit, Chapter 40, along with bits of Chapter 45, and you'll see how they are related here when we start to discuss what this chapter is going to bring to the table. And it does relate to a lot of the stuff we've talked about in this unit, which is communication, and that's what we're going to see here with regulation and feedback. Now, Chapter 40, if you were to look at it in the book, it contains quite a bit of other information, and we're actually going to pick up bits and pieces of the last two sections of this particular chapter. So if you wanted to go to the book and get some more supplemental information, that's where you would go, is to the last couple of sections in Chapter 40, okay? But it does discuss a lot of the very detailed information that we're going to talk about in terms of regulation and feedback, okay? That's where we're going with this one. Now there's a few essential knowledges here that you make sure you got to cover, and we're going to hit all of these in this particular chapter, so go back and check these and make sure that once you get done with this information, you kind of understand what you read there in front of you. Okay, so Section 4 discusses the general idea known as homeostasis. And now if you have been keeping up on the big ideas, the big idea sheets, one of the big ideas, Big Idea 2, deals with animals utilizing energy to maintain their homeostasis. And you probably know what the homeostasis of an animal is. It's the kind of set limits, okay, that the animal likes, all right? It likes, for instance, humans like a internal body temperature of 98.6 degrees, right? And so our body utilizes many different types of techniques and different types of mechanisms to maintain that particular temperature in our body. One of the things that we oftentimes forget, because that's the example that's used often is temperature regulation in human beings. One of the things we oftentimes forget is that our body is full of fluid, right? And so this fluid, not necessarily blood, right? Blood definitely needs to be regulated in terms of what's in it and how much stuff is in it and stuff like that. But this other stuff called interstitial fluid, and I believe I've mentioned interstitial fluid at least once before. But if you were to take, forgive me if this is kind of gross, but if you were to take, a knife here and basically kind of slice this skin here and slice it down here and then slice it down here and basically roll that flap of skin back without, let's say you could cut no blood vessels at all. No blood vessels are cut, so you wouldn't actually bleed, but you'd roll that back there, and you'd see this kind of glistening, kind of clear liquid. That would be considered interstitial fluid, okay? So interstitial fluid is this fluid that bathes the rest of your body internally, okay? Your blood vessels should be containing all of the blood. You shouldn't have blood that's just running willy-nilly through your body. Then you have a really good chance of dying. That's called internal bleeding, and you can die from that. So the rest of your body needs to be coated in, or the rest of the internal part of your body needs to be coated in this fluid as well. And that particular fluid needs to be kept right. It needs to be kept in homeostasis as well. There's many, many different important things that are dissolved in that fluid that would make you want to keep it within these set limits, which is what homeostasis does. And so this section, and this entire chapter, we're going to talk about homeostatic control mechanisms eventually, okay? So we have discussed a little bit about homeostasis in the previous slide there, but homeostasis is the body's ability to kind of balance within a certain set limit, right? And so as a result, we as human beings would be called regulators. A regulator uses internal control mechanisms to moderate internal change. There are other extremes that animals tend to gravitate towards, which would be called conformers. Okay, so certain animals choose to sign on to this ability to conform to their external environment. So their internal conditions of their body would vary with the changes to the external environment. Okay, so basically their internal environment is subject to whatever the external environment is. Okay, whether that be temperature, whether that be osmolarity. Okay, we've talked about a couple of different types of fish, which would be considered osmoconformers. Okay, most of those conformers are marine type of animals. And most of the animals we tend to think about are regulators. Even some very, very simple ones like mice, they happen to be regulators. Okay, so many different animals utilize this regulatory mechanism to cope with their environmental fluctuations, whereas some organisms like fish tend to be more conformers. Cold-blooded animals tend to be more conformers. Warm-blooded animals tend to be more regulators, although that is not the hard and fast rule. Right? There are fish out there that can regulate their body temperatures, for instance. All right. So these are the two main strategies that animals will use to cope with these environmental fluctuations, being a regulator or being a conformer. The picture of the guy on the slide is a guy named Warren G. He's an old-time rapper from my childhood, back when rap was good, and he does a song called Regulators. I used to play it. I don't anymore. If you really want to hear it, we can listen to it, but you just have to ask, okay? So we'll move on from there. Anyway, let's talk about mechanisms of homeostasis. There's two main mechanisms of homeostasis, of keeping your body within these set limits that it so likes, okay? There's a process known as negative feedback, okay? Negative feedback is where you get a buildup of some end product in oftentimes a chemical reaction or the initiation of a response through some pathway, maybe a cellular pathway. And either the buildup of this product or this response that is initiated will shut down a system, okay? These are oftentimes the types of mechanisms that we see in our bodies. They help regulate things. If a certain amount of something gets high, then that pathway will shut down, okay? And so we want to have ways to regulate these chemical pathways so that when we start to make some kind of chemical product, we can shut it down. We don't want to just run away willy-nilly with the creation of these products, okay? And this is most often what we see in terms of homeostatic mechanisms in our body. They're the ones that are really kind of the easiest to understand because they tend to keep us alive, right? Now, the other type of homeostatic mechanism is called positive feedback, okay? And a positive feedback is a change in or the production of a variable that triggers a mechanism that will amplify a change, okay? And so oftentimes when you get the way that these positive feedback mechanisms work is where you might have a chemical pathway, maybe a chemical product has been created. Instead of an increase in that chemical product shutting the system down, which is what negative feedback would be, the way positive feedback works is that you would have an increase in some product, and the increase in that product just amplifies the pathway even more. Okay, so it's almost like turning up the dial to 11. Okay, it goes past what it should be, and it amplifies it even more. Now, with some pathways, that is good, right? Well, some might think it's good, but there are definitely bad parts of it. But oftentimes, positive feedback mechanisms, or positive feedback loops, as they're sometimes called, can be deadly. Okay. Now, I've listed 3 examples of physiological positive feedback systems that we do see, and 2 of them are deadly. 2 of them will kill you. The other one will make you feel as if you want to die. Okay. So now, uterine contractions in childbirth are an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Okay. Now, the way that these work is that I'm going to kind of go through each one of these and talk about them in a little bit more in depth, because the positive feedback ones are a little bit more difficult to understand. Okay, so uterine contractions in childbirth are controlled by a chemical called oxytocin. Okay, and oxytocin is a chemical that will cause muscles to contract in the uterus. Now, once the once the mother starts to go into labor and the uterus starts to contract kind of on its own, the uterus will actually release oxytocin, okay? And that release of oxytocin kind of feeds back into the uterus and causes it to contract even more. And when that uterus contracts even more, it causes more oxytocin to be created, and that oxytocin feeds back to the uterus and causes those contractions to get even more intense, and eventually it kicks the baby out. Okay, the contraction, if you think about what a contraction is, right? If I contract my finger muscles, they go like this, right? This finger muscle right here, if I contract it, like that, okay? So if I contract all of them, they get smaller, okay? My hand gets smaller as a result because all these muscles in here contract, okay? Now that's what happens to a uterus. The uterus is like a giant muscle, okay? It's not giant until the baby gets in it, but it's this giant muscle that surrounds the baby, and the oxytocin causes it to contract or squeeze. And that's literally what's getting the baby out, is these intense squeezing contractions that surround the baby and basically push it out, okay? This is going to be really weird and gross. I've got this thing just so you can kind of see what would happen, but picture this netted ball right here. The net, it would be the uterus, the uterine material, okay, the muscle that surrounds the baby. You could think of the green thing as the baby. Now, we wouldn't want this to actually happen to a baby, but let's say that this muscle surrounding the baby contracts. What's going to happen to the baby? It comes out, right? And we would imagine that this is not ideal. You don't want the baby broken into a bunch of little bubbles like that. But when I squeeze the muscle, the baby comes out. Baby comes out. Isn't that fun? So that's kind of what happens with the uterine contractions. And every time that muscle squeezes, it releases more oxytocin, and that oxytocin feeds back into the loop. I kind of know from personal experience how intense and painful this can be. My wife is a very slight woman. She's maybe 100 pounds, and she will be the first to tell you that she's not an athlete and she can't lift a whole lot of weights and things of that nature. She's not super athletic. But during contractions with our first child, I remember this. I will never forget it. She had a hold of these 3 fingers right here. Okay, these exact 3. I used to have a different wedding ring that was much bigger and harder. And she is the smallest woman in the world, and she, during one of the very intense contractions, grabbed a hold of these 3 fingers and squeezed as hard as she could, and it buckled me. I was on my knees, and I felt bad because it hurt so bad. I thought she was going to break my pinky finger over my wedding ring when she did it. And so I know that those contractions can get absolutely devastatingly painful because of this positive feedback loop. They start out small, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and harder and harder and harder, and it more and more painful. And to the point where my teeny wife almost destroyed my fingers over my wedding ring. She turned into the Incredible Hulk in like 5 seconds. It was the craziest thing ever. But that's how these positive feedback systems work. They just work to amplify anything that they happen to interact with, okay? Sepsis and anaphylaxis are both positive feedback mechanisms of your immune system, okay? Sepsis is a term that means like wide scale or large scale infection of your body. Anaphylaxis is a type of allergic response to some kind of allergen. Oftentimes bee poison is a big one. And the mechanism by which they kill people is that of positive feedback through the immune system, because the immune system also works with allergic reactions, okay? And so let's just talk briefly about anaphylaxis, and you can apply that to sepsis. More people would relate, I think, to anaphylaxis because more people might be allergic to nuts or bee poison or whatever it might be. So the way that this works, your immune system has these cells called mast cells. And mast cells, when they interact with an allergen, are going to release this chemical, okay, called histamine. And what histamine does, histamine is a chemical that will basically widen your blood vessels and make the blood vessels very big so that blood can get to the site of an infection, okay? Because when blood gets to the site of an infection, you get your immune system cells there to fight the infection, okay? And so anaphylaxis works where these mast cells are released, they're releasing their histamines, and the histamines will open up the blood vessels, okay? And so when you get this very targeted, large-scale response through a very massive allergic reaction, what you get is like basically all of your mast cells in your body release histamine, and there's so much histamine in your body that it dilates or makes your blood vessels big everywhere. And what it does is it delivers blood to your extremities. So it delivers blood to your fingers and your toes and your arms and your legs and your head and your face. And all of your blood, if it's out at your extremities, is no longer at your core, okay? And that's another thing that we'll talk about, is the fact that the core of your body is vitally important, right? And if all of that blood goes away from your heart, there's nothing left for your heart to pump, okay? And so your blood pressure plummets drastically, and as a result, you enter anaphylactic shock and possibly die, okay? And the counteraction of this is epinephrine. Epinephrine, we've talked about this already, and this is where everything comes full cycle, and it's so cool that it is linked like this. Epinephrine is a chemical that basically does the exact opposite of histamine. Histamine basically opens up all your blood vessels to deliver immune system cells to sites of infection, whereas epinephrine closes all of the blood vessels in your extremities, okay, and it shuttles all that blood back to your heart, okay. That's exactly what it does, because you want to be able to keep the core of your body ready and rocking for a bear fight, right? And so that's kind of how anaphylaxis works. And the way that this happens is that the interaction between the allergen that you come in contact with and your immune system just spins out of control. The product of the histamine creates more mast cells to release more histamine, which creates more mast cells to release more histamine, and so on and so forth. And sepsis works very similarly, where you get the basically the runaway reaction of all of your immune system cells, which also release things like histamine, okay? So it's a fascinating process. If you did have more questions, maybe I sped through that, feel free to ask about them, okay? Long story short is we have mechanisms that will shut down certain pathways or certain systems, and we have other mechanisms that will ramp certain systems up. And we'll talk about examples of both of these in the second video, okay? So what I'd like to do now, I'd like to show you a couple of short videos. Let's see here, we'll escape. Show you a video of the negative feedback system and also the positive feedback one.
This simple animation illustrates the principle of negative feedback, or feedback inhibition, in the regulation of a chemical reaction sequence in a cell. The sequence involves 4 molecules, A, B, C, and D. 3 different enzymes catalyze the conversion of one molecule to the next. The final product, D, inhibits the first enzyme in the sequence. When the concentration of D rises to a certain point, the reaction shuts itself down.
So we see here at the end of the reaction, we got product D feeds back. That's where we get that term negative feedback. Feeds back into the system to this very beginning molecule in the pathway, and it interacts with it in a way that shuts down the rest of the system. Okay. Let's look at positive feedback.
In positive feedback, a product of the reaction sequence enhances the action of one of the enzymes, increasing the rate of production of the product. Positive feedback is less common than negative feedback in living systems.
Okay, so they didn't really show what positive feedback would do, but let's pretend that Z is the final product in this particular pathway. Maybe it feeds back and somehow interacts with this chemical right here, the second one in the pathway, and causes it to maybe speed up its production of Y times 2. And maybe it amplifies the production of Y times 2, some kind of interaction. And then if you're amplifying Y times 2, you're going to get double the amount of Z. When you get double the amount of Z, it comes back and feeds back even faster into this pathway. So you get this positive feedback loop that just keeps feeding on itself. Okay? All right. So let's go ahead and we're going to work our way through this. We're going to apply this to different types of systems. Okay? So a homeostatic control system has 3 functional components, as you kind of see with this example here. Generally speaking, they have a receptor, they have a control center, and they have an effector. Okay, now those are really generic terms, and we're going to show you how this kind of applies to this example up in front of you right now. The control center for this particular example is that of your thermostat at home, and this is a great time to do this example here. because you guys may have experienced this. I know I do at my house, and I'll use my example as a result. Okay, so the thermostat is your control center. You set the temperature that you want your house at, and everything else takes care of itself. We also have a receptor. Inside of that thermostat, there is probably a thermometer of some kind, a tool that is used to basically receive the temperature and decide what the temperature is, okay? And then we also have what is known as an effector. The effector is the thing in the system that will either raise or lower the temperature. So in this case, it would be the heater being turned on or off, okay, which we see right here. Let me get the pointer out. So it would be the heater being turned on or being turned off, okay? Now, we can equate these things to things in our body. The control center, let you guess, is probably your brain, right? There is a control center in your brain that kind of keeps track of everything. Oftentimes it is the hypothalamus, sometimes it is not. But that's all part of your brain and things that are located in your brain. We also have receptors. Hey, we've got receptors in our fingers that measure how hot or cold something is, right? They tend to be cells or nerves that are specifically created in your body to perceive hot and cold, okay? So we have many different types of receptors. And then we have these things called effectors, okay, in our bodies, things that will then effect some kind of change, cause some kind of change. And we'll talk about specific examples of those in some of the material we'll get to at the end here, okay? Now, what we're looking at here is an example of how your thermostat works at home. Now, once you set your thermostat to a certain level, let's say it's at ours at home, it's during the winter, it's 71 degrees, okay? If it gets too hot, now let's do it gets too cold, all right? So obviously in the wintertime it's going to get too cold, right? So let's say the house goes below that, like 70, maybe 70, 69, 68, something like that. Gets too cold. The thermostat is going to perceive this. It's going to receive the information that the house is too cold. It's going to tell the thermostat that the house is too cold. We need to do something, so it will put in effect, okay, the effector, a way to raise the temperature, and that is a signal, an electrical signal to the heater to turn on. So at that point, the heater turns on, creates some heat. Okay, so this is the thing that's being created. Okay, this is going to be an actual negative feedback control system. So we're creating heat. Okay, and then you can see behind here it says heat is produced. Okay, heat is produced. As heat is produced, the room temperature increases. As the room temperature increases, the thermostat, or pardon me, the thermometer perceives this and notices it. And then it sends a message to the thermostat, says, okay, the temperature's good, let's shut off the temperature, or let's shut off the heater, okay? And so this is an example of negative feedback. The product here, heat, feeds back into the system, which eventually causes it to shut down because it's getting too hot, all right? Now, let's say it is summertime, and it is too hot. Okay, let's say we set the temperature again at 71. Maybe that's what we like it at. And it gets to be 72, 73, 74. It realizes it's getting too hot. And in this case, maybe we're going to either turn the heater off, which it probably already is, or maybe we're also going to turn on the air conditioner. Okay, that would be an example here. We could turn on the air conditioner. Maybe instead of no heat being produced, we produce cold air. The room temperature decreases, and eventually it reaches the set point. Okay, the thermometer says, okay, we're back down to 71. This is great. Control center thermostat, you can shut this air conditioner down. Okay, so again, this is a negative feedback thing. The thing that we're producing, which is in this case air or no heat, feeds back into the system and tells it to stop. Okay, so that would be an example of a negative feedback control system. Now, since we use this example of a heater and maybe an air conditioner, I thought one of the first things we would go through in terms of describing feedback or homeostatic control mechanisms would be thermoregulation. Okay, thermoregulation is oftentimes one of the easier ones for people to understand because it's something that they experience on an everyday level. Okay, you're probably experiencing it right now while you watch this. Maybe you're bundled up in a blanket, so you have to find a way to increase your heat, you put a blanket on, right? So thermal regulation is the process by which animals maintain an internal temperature within tolerable ranges. Now, there's different ways for animals to maintain the heat that they like, okay, the internal temperature that they like. Some of those are physiological, meaning that your body just kind of enacts them when they need to. Some of them might be behavioral. I just mentioned one there. Behavioral one would be going to get a blanket and put it on. Okay, but there are 5 general adaptations that help animals thermoregulate. We'll go through some of them very quickly. Some of them we will spend a little bit more time on. For instance, insulation. Insulation, easy one, right? We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, adding insulation or a barrier between yourself and the elements is going to help you maintain internal heat, right? And here's some examples that we see on the screen. These little birds, they have to maintain their internal temperatures within a certain limit. So they have these downy feathers, and the downy feathers act as a big barrier. Okay, it's hard for the cold air to get through these feathers. Okay, see our giant sheepdog here. Yeah, he's got a lot of fur. Okay, that fur acts as insulation or a barrier between himself and the external environment. That would be akin to you putting on a blanket, right? Or, hey, a down comforter. Here we see this is kind of gross, but it's a bunch of people carving up a whale. And that whale has large amounts of blubber. Okay, so some animals just eat a lot of fat to put that fat barrier in between themselves and the core of their body. So an easy one to understand because you guys partake in this every season when it gets cold. We also have some circulatory adaptations, and these circulatory adaptations are maybe counterintuitive. Okay. Vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Okay, basically what that means is vein dilation and vein constriction, vein opening and vein closing. If I'm going to constrict something, I'm going to make it smaller. Okay, I'm going to make it smaller. If I'm going to dilate something, you've always heard the people who have dilated pupils. They've got these giant pupils. You're going to make something bigger. So when we talk about vasodilation, we're making the veins inside of our body bigger. Okay, that can happen. And vasoconstrictions means we're making the veins inside of our body tighter. Okay, so naturally, let's think about what would happen if we make our veins bigger. We go from something like this to something like this. What's going to be able to flow through it better? Blood, right? Blood. Now, when we do this, this is an actual adaptation that will cool us down, okay? And the reason that it cools us down, we do this when we get hot, okay? The reason that we do this when we get hot is because when we increase the width of our blood vessels, we can allow that warm blood to pass through at a greater rate, okay? Just like a hose. If you have a wider hose, more stuff can get through it. If you have wider blood vessels, more blood can get through it. And what we do as this adaptation for us to cool down is that we want to shuttle the blood, the warm blood, to our extremities, okay? I want to shuttle warm blood to my ears. I want to shuttle warm blood to my fingers, because what we do when we do that is we increase the surface area with which we can lose heat, okay? So as I'm putting warm blood into my fingertips, because I've increased blood flow to my extremities by making my blood vessels bigger, I'm going to have more heat radiate out of my hands. I'm going to have more heat radiate out of my ears. I'm going to have more heat radiate out of all of the skin on my body. That's where a lot of that warm blood is sent, is directly to the skin, which is why you kind of feel hot during those instances, because you have all that warm blood being shuttled to your skin to dissipate, right? We want to get rid of that heat to the atmosphere, okay? And so when we do that, the blood is exposed to a greater surface area, and we know that when you expose things to a greater surface area, they have a better opportunity for movement, right? And so vasodilation is there as an adaptation for us to combat being hot, okay? We want to cool down. Vasoconstriction, on the other hand, is an adaptation to combat being cold, okay? And that, again, that seems counterintuitive, because when we are cold, right, oftentimes the things that get cold first are our fingers, our toes, our ears, our nose, right? The skin, the outer parts of our body. And that's normal. That's supposed to happen. And the reason for that is because your body values what goes on here. I'm not trying to be like meta or super like ooey and gooey and gushy. Ooh, that's all in the heart. It is literally all in the heart. Your core of your body has your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your liver. Everything that really matters to keeping you alive is right here in the center of your body. And what vasoconstriction does, it closes down the blood vessels in your extremities, okay? It makes them smaller, right? And if those blood vessels get smaller, less blood's going to flow through them. If less blood is flowing to my hands and fingers and toes and nose, where is it instead? It should be at the core of your body, right? So that warm blood is now kept at the core of your body instead of being out here in your fingers and toes. So vasoconstriction allows for us to stay alive. Remember, that's the key of your body, is it wants to stay alive, right? And it allows you this ability to stay alive while keeping the warm blood in the core of your body as opposed to keeping it out in your fingers, okay? It doesn't do you any good here, right? That's not keeping you alive, so it shuttles it away back into the core of your body, which does keep you alive, all right? Now, the next video here, I will try to link this. I'm not sure if I have the video anymore. If you guys have ever seen Bear Grylls, he does a bit here with Will Ferrell where he provides an exercise or a way to overcome vasoconstriction. Okay, they're in like the Arctic Circle or something like that, and basically what he does is he forces blood back into his fingers to warm them up, while using centrifugal force, I think. Yeah, I'll link the video. You guys can watch it, and it does work. If we were in class, I'd have you all stand up like fools and do what he does, and you can actually see the blood pump to your hands because your palms get super bright red. It's really kind of neat. So you can overcome vasoconstriction if you are cold, although your body does it as a natural effect to keep you alive. All right. Some animals have what are called countercurrent heat exchangers. Countercurrent heat exchangers, oftentimes found in marine animals, mainly because they live in or near water. And again, this is important for reducing heat loss at the core of your body. And what this does is it supplies considerably warmer blood to the core of your body when it's really needed. Now, I've seen this before in certain animals, especially aquatic animals. I think I mentioned to you guys at some point that I've bought these glow-in-the-dark fish, right? And they're really expensive. And I went to change the water on them for the very first time. And this water was sitting out in the greenhouse back by our science office, and it was just getting to be warmer out, but it wasn't warm enough yet. And that water was still pretty cold. So I brought that water down here. I knew it had been sitting out. And then I put it in the fish tank. I went to go bring the water jugs back to the greenhouse. I came back, and all my fish were dead. They were dead in like 5 minutes, okay? And that's because they experienced a cold shock, and that cold shock killed them. And that's because the core of their body got so cold that their functions just ceased. They stopped. Kind of crazy, but that's exactly what happened, okay? Now, some of these animals that live in these marine environments will sometimes experience these drastic temperature switches depending on the part of the environment that they live in. For instance, this goose right here, maybe it doesn't spend all of its time under cold water, but part of its body is in cold water. When it's swimming around, it's got its feet in there, or when it's just kind of wading around in cold water, its feet are sitting in there. And if you look at this diagram here, the bottom of its foot, which would be down here, experiences cold temperatures, like 9 degrees Celsius, very, very cold, almost freezing, right? And we know that blood from his heart goes down to his toes to give them oxygen and things like that, right? But that blood has to come back to the core of the body. That blood cools down to the ambient temperature of like 9 degrees Celsius. We don't want that 9 degrees Celsius blood to go back directly to the heart. It would kill the goose, okay? And some of you guys might be okay with that because they hold up your traffic in the middle of town here. But these little guys here experience, hold on. Could experience drastic temperature changes to the core of their body, which would kill them if that 9 degree temperature blood went right back to the heart. So they have these circulatory adaptations called countercurrent heat exchangers, where this warm blood from the arteries, okay, which started at the heart is at about 35 degrees Celsius for this guy, would come down normally to the foot of the goose, deliver the blood, and then come back cold, right? But what we see happen is that this vein that brings oxygen-less blood back to the heart is actually warming up. That blood is warming up as it's going back. And the reason for that is because this vein is in such close proximity to the artery that brings the warm blood. And so there's actually a transfer of heat from the arterial blood to the venous blood that returns. And so that's a really nice adaptation that warms the venous blood back up before it can get to the heart and kill the goose, right? And so by the time this blood gets back to the core of the goose, it's at about 33 degrees Celsius, which the goose can handle, okay? It could not handle a temperature of 9 degrees Celsius. It would kill it. But as that venous blood comes back, it is warmed up by this radiation of heat from the arterial blood so that it experiences less of a temperature shift, okay? So dolphins have something very similar in their fins as well. All right. Some organisms cool themselves by evaporative heat loss. We also do this. Sweating would be an example of this. Bathing, panting in dogs is an example of this. Rolling around in mud for pigs is an example of this. We have talked about evaporative heat loss, so I don't feel that I need to go into that any further. Okay. Some organisms experience or use behavioral responses. Like we as human beings, we can use, or we do use a lot of these different mechanisms to maintain certain levels of temperature in our body. The example I've got here in a video, and I think I have this video and I'll link it, is a really, really cool one. So I'm just going to leave it at that and let you guys watch the video. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. It's about a desert chameleon, I think. So I'll let you do that, but behavioral responses for human beings would be like, I'm going to go put a blanket on, or I'm going to go put more layers on, or I'm going to turn the air conditioner on, those types of things, or I'm going to find shade, okay? Those are just things that we would normally do through our behavior that would cool us down, okay? And finally, some animals can adjust their metabolic heat production, and we can kind of do the same types of things. We can adjust how much heat we produce based on what we're doing and how much we consume. But the example I wanted to show you here was the homeostatic control mechanism of how we keep our body within a certain limit of 36 to 38 degrees Celsius, okay? So let's talk about how this goes really quickly. All right. I think I'm going to draw on this one here first. Is that going to work? Yes. We got that awkward... thing there. Okay, so we've got our control center here, which is our body. This would be called the hypothalamus in our body, or our brain, if you want to call it that. And our brain says that we like to be at 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. That's great. We're going to try to keep it that way. Now, let's say we have some kind of strenuous activity that brings our body temperature up. Okay, so it goes above 38 degrees. Maybe it gets up to 39 degrees Celsius at this point. And so we've got our increasing body temperature, and the hypothalamus in our brain recognizes this, okay? It recognizes this and then sends a signal to enact some cooling mechanisms. And the first mechanism is a message that tells our sweat glands to secrete sweat, and so our body will cool evaporatively. The second mechanism that we see is one that we've already talked about. The blood vessels in our skin will dilate, okay, and the capillaries will fill with warm blood, okay? And it will bring that warm blood to the surface of our skin, to our extremities, like our fingers and toes, and that heat will dissipate, okay? So we've got a circulatory adaptation and an evaporative cooling adaptation. Both of these things should reduce or decrease the body's temperature, and as a result, this is a negative feedback loop or a negative feedback system. We should reduce our temperature back down to maybe 37 degrees, okay? Now, that is happy for our brain. It says, okay, we're in that set limit of 36 to 38. We happen to be right at 37, which is good for us. Now, let's say it starts to get cold outside, okay? It's starting to get colder. It's 30 degrees at nighttime. When you're sitting at home, your body temperature decreases. So instead of being 36 degrees, maybe it's 34 degrees. That's actually quite low. It's 34 degrees at some point, and you're like, oh man, it's really, really cold. Your brain recognizes this, okay? And your brain then sends a message to your blood vessels, okay? This is maybe a drastic example. Sends a message to your blood vessels that this fool is going to die if he doesn't get a blanket on, or something like that. And he's way too cold. So we have to lock down the blood vessels in our extremities. We've got to constrict the blood vessels in our fingers and toes. All right, guy, it's going to get, or girl, it's going to get really, really cold in your fingers, nose, and toes, and ears. But we're going to shuttle all that blood back to the core of your body, okay? It also, the brain will send a message to your muscles, and this is the one we've experienced before as well, where your skeletal muscles will all of a sudden start contracting almost uncontrollably, because your brain's telling it to do that without you physically or consciously telling it to do that. So technically that is the definition of uncontrollably. Your muscles will start to uncontrollably shake. Okay, that is shivering. And what that does is that generates heat. Okay, that basically creates this situation where your body uses a lot of ATP, and one of the side effects of using ATP is extra heat energy that's released, because it's not a 100% efficient process. So you get literal heat energy that is released from the breakdown of ATP because your muscles have started shivering. Okay, both of these things, the shuttling of warm blood back to the core and the generation of actual ambient heat through muscular contraction are going to increase the body's temperature, maybe back up to 37 degrees, and it will act as a negative feedback loop and cause your brain to say, okay, we're back up to the right level, let's shut all this stuff down that we just did. You'll stop shivering, your fingers and toes will start to get warm because the blood vessels have opened back up again. It's this constant back and forth. You're always fluctuating within these ranges, and the wintertime is a great time to experience that, because there'll be times when you put a blanket on and all of a sudden you'll be too hot, then you take the blanket off and you want to put it back on. That is your body going through this cycle of too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold. And you're constantly playing this game of trying to stay somewhere in the middle. Okay? So that's a really easy example of thermoregulation. We see the negative feedback system quite often in these scenarios. And in the next section, the next video, I'm going to talk more specifically about some of the other types of feedback systems that we might see in our body. Okay?